All right. Welcome to Remix EQ Live, where we're amplifying equity with a remix of information, interviews, and inspiration. I'm your host, Dr. Erica Tate, and today I'm broadcasting live from Savannah, Georgia, where I live. So for those who are joining us today, please drop a greeting of choice in the comments and let us know where you are joining us from and the equity work you do or aspire to do. And remember that Remix EQ Live is an experience that's meant to be shared. So I encourage you to hit the share and invite buttons and bring along your people, your network, your family, your friends, your peers to join our Remix EQ community today. And while those comments are flowing in and those invitations are flowing out, I want to remind you that Remix EQ Live offers the opportunity for us to connect and build community with each other around the equity work being performed throughout the world. And we do this by centering the work. That is, our guests and viewers share examples of what they do in their role or position as a way to illustrate the innovative and effective ways they advance equity in the spaces in which they live, work, or play. So, throughout the show and in the comments, I invite you to also share what you do to make the world a more just place. So today we are back with another Remix EQ interview show. We are remixing Dr. Yolanda A. Rankin, assistant professor in the School of Information at Florida State University, with Dr. Jakita O. Thomas, the Philpott WestPoint-Stevens Distinguished Professor of Computer Science and Software Engineering at Auburn University, founder of Grab Your Grant, and co-founder of Pharaoh's Conclave. Today's conversation centers on Black women in computing as we discuss applying Black feminist epistemologies to the study and support of Black women as they learn and practice in the fields of computing. So, Remix EQ community, let us welcome our guests and begin this conversation for change. So, Dr. Jakita Thomas, I invite you to introduce yourself, and as you do, please share any career twists and turns that have led you to your role.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much, Erica, for the invitation to share. In terms of my career trajectory and these twists and turns, I originally always wanted to be in the academy, but I didn't start there. When it came time for me to finish graduate school, I did my undergrad at Spelman in computer science. I did my PhD at Georgia Tech, also in computer science. And when I was getting close to defending, I went on the market for academic jobs. And at the time, it just felt like 6 years felt like a really big commitment. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted my research trajectory and agenda to be. And so I actually made the most unexpected pivot for me that I thought I was going to make. I went into industry. I went to IBM Research Lab in Almaden in San Jose, California, and I was there for about 6 years. I was able to meet some incredible people, including one of my mentors, Mark Dean, who told me maybe about 2 weeks after I started at IBM, he asked me what I wanted to do. I told him that I knew I wanted to be an academic and perhaps even a future college president. And he said, well, you don't need to stay here longer than 5 years. So figure out what you need to figure out so that you can transition back into the academy. And so that's exactly what I did. I did end up going into the academy. I joined Spelman's faculty in 2010, and then was there for 6 years. And now I'm at Auburn University, and I've been at Auburn University since 2016.
Ooh, thank you so much. I appreciate your discussion of going from industry to academia and your aspirations of being a college president. Yes. I love it. Oh, and Dr. Yolanda Rankin, I too invite you to introduce yourself. And as you do, please share any career twists and turns that have led you to your current role. Well, make sure you come off mute.
Yes, sorry about that. Okay. So I was thinking about how I started thinking or even considering computer science as a career option for me. And this started out when I was a senior in undergrad at Tupelo College. My professors encouraged me to apply to graduate school. I wasn't really thinking about it because I was a mathematics major. And I had taken computer science courses there at Toulouse College, but they didn't have a major in computer science. You could minor but not major in it. So when I applied to graduate school, that's when I made the switch to computer science. And I went to Kent State. And at the time, there were two Black women in the master's program for computer science. I was one, and of course, the other person. And by the end of my first year, going into my second year, I was the only one, meaning she left the program. And so, needless to say, that wasn't the best environment for Black women, but I persevered. I got through it. But I applied to the PhD program as well and had the opportunity to interview and receive an offer from AT&T Bell Labs in Illinois. And so I was faced with a decision about, do I continue on and do the PhD or do I go work in industry? And so at that point, I was so tired of having to fight all these different negative forces that I decided I would, hey, gladly take a job in industry. And so I started my career as a software engineer at AT&T Bell Labs, and I worked on a lot of different features in wireless networks. And so that gave me a very broad perspective of the kind of jobs. And it also taught me that computer science is more than just programming. I mean, there are people at AT&T Bell Labs, their job was simply to test software. That's all they did. They didn't write any code, they just tested. And there were people, of course, like myself, who wrote lines and lines of code, but then there were people who did customer support. And so they did different roles. When I say customer support, I'm not talking about your 1-800 number, how can I help you? I'm talking about managing different customer markets and having to be the first person that they contact when there's a technical issue, managing how software updates were deployed in that market. I mean, all these different aspects of computing. And so this was quite fun for me. But eventually, after working in industry for several years, I decided that I did want to go ahead and finish my PhD. I did want to go ahead and do that. And so I returned back to graduate school at Northwestern in computer science. And I was one of three Black women. One ended up leaving the program again. And I ended up, even though I was the one that was the newest to the program, I was the first to finish. So the first to finish in terms of a PhD in computer science, a Black woman at Northwestern. That was in 2008. So things really haven't changed that much for Black women in the field of computing. So even in that time span of having very limited numbers of Black women in the field of computing, I still found myself contemplating industry or academia. After all, I actually went back to graduate school to do my PhD because I wanted to focus on educational technology. I wanted to be a college professor. But like Jakita, IBM made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I ended up in industry again. But I think that was good. It was good because I got a chance to just focus on research. And that helped me to understand better why I was seeing the dismal numbers of Black women in the field. And so at that point, I decided to do something about it. And I started my academic career as an assistant professor at Spelman College. So that's the path. And then eventually I switched over to Florida State University. That's the path that led me to where I am today.
Yeah, thank you. I love like this industry academic. You did it twice, pathway, and also in your story, you can kind of hear about like the Black women who were with you dropping out of the program and really kind of preview, why you're doing the work that you're doing in this space. And so thank you guys for sharing your journey. It's really wonderful to hear how people like yourself get to where you are, and that it's not always a straight line. So great. Oh, we have a comment. Hey, Brianna. She's saying hello from Tallahassee. Look at you, Floridians. Even though I know. Thank you for sharing your journey. And she loves hearing about your twists and turns. Yes. So thank you. So for those who are just joining us, this is Remix EQ Live, where we are amplifying equity through a remix of information, interviews, and inspiration. And now that you've had the chance to meet or reconnect with Drs. Jakita Thomas and Yolanda Rankin, I know that you are inviting others to tune in. And of course, I invite you to interact with us. Post your comments to say hello, ask questions, share examples and learnings as we dive into this interview. You are part of this Remix EQ experience, and you are part of this Remix EQ community. And last show, we started posting a comment prior to the show to kind of prompt and encourage your engagement with us. So please share your burning questions about studying and supporting Black women experiences in computing, or if you have any practices or examples that you are engaged in about how you listen to and learn from Black women about their experiences in computing, please share them in the comments during the show or even after, as we're still connected in this digital space. So now we center the work. This is our opportunity for us to learn from Yolanda and Jakita about how and why they support Black women in computing, specifically their perspectives, their methodologies, and of course, their motivations. So we'll start with you, Dr. Jakita Thomas. As a professor and scholar activist, how does your research in the field of intersectional computing shape how Black women participate in computing education and careers?
So I think a really good entry point into that question is to tell the story of how intersectional computing sort of came to be. And Yolanda and I just recently published a piece. I think it's on the way out in the Interactions magazine. We have a forum where we talk a little bit about this story. But for me, it really started in 2011, 2012, when I started working with this group of Black girls in what would ultimately become a program or project called Supporting Computational Algorithmic Thinking. The purpose of that project was to try to understand how Black girls develop their ability to design, implement, and assess algorithms in the context of designing games that address social issues that they care about. And so I ultimately, over the course of almost a decade, continued working with the same set of girls. And so I kicked this program off in like 2011, 2012, had gotten some NSF funding to help support it. And in 2015, I went to a Grace Hopper conference, which is like a celebration for women in computing, where women from everywhere, come to connect and learn and share and all the great things. That particular year, I brought my daughter Vivian. She was 5 years old at the time, and she's an artist. She's a dancer, singer, entertainer, but she also loves technology. And so I felt like it would be a really great opportunity for her to meet, women along various pathways in computing to get her exposed to that. Well, when I came and brought her, there were like a few things that happened that were a little surprising and unexpected. One was that even though I had registered her for the conference, they told me that she could not attend any of the sessions. They said that she was too young to attend the sessions. And I thought to myself at the time, wow, here's a young girl who's interested in computing as a potential, career maybe one day. She has a passion for it. But then also thinking about, well, what does that signal to like nursing mothers or mothers who have infants who want to still stay connected within the community, but there's no childcare provided on site. So how does that impact their ability to sort of move and sustain themselves within this community? So that was one thing. The second thing, though, which I think was a little more impactful in terms of sort of moving other folks outside of just me, was that particular year, there was not a single Black woman that was featured on the main Grace Hopper stage as a featured speaker, as a featured sort of keynote. The leadership did not reflect the diversity that was happening inside of the field either. And in fact, that year was very significant because there was a white man who made some very controversial remarks on the main stage that actually made the national news. And so meanwhile, maybe a day or so later, there was a Black women in computing luncheon, like kind of like a subgroup of the larger convening. And it was standing room only. And we kept thinking, well, why is this Black woman not being featured on the main stage? There's clearly an audience of people here who want to hear her. She clearly has something really impactful and amazing to say. And the support that was provided for each of the different affinity groups was not comparable. So there was no food at our luncheon, but a comparable affinity group had a full, situation because there had been corporate sponsors engaged on their behalf. So there was like just a lot of little things that sort of happened. And normally, when we as Black women would go to these conferences, conferences for women, conferences for the field of computing, we have what's called like the meeting after the meeting, where we're like all kind of crammed up in somebody's hotel room, and we're sort of like, what in the world has happened? Like, this didn't work and that didn't work and this was weird and that was weird. But this time, it wasn't just the meeting after the meeting in somebody's hotel room. There were conversations in the bathrooms, there were conversations in between sessions, and we decided that we were going to say something to the leadership. And the question that came back when we laid out our, grievances, if you will, was, well, we've designed this experience to be one that serves women. What's different about the experiences of Black women from everybody else? Like, why isn't this working for you, essentially? And we didn't have the language at that time to describe empirically, theoretically, specifically why. We only know what we saw and we know how it made us feel. And so, myself, uh, Dr. Rankin, Jamaica Burge, Quincy Brown, Maeve Houston. I mean, there were like so many of us, who at that conference was sort of like an impetus for us to start to take action. And intersectional computing really came out of the question, the pushback that we got, that kept asking, well, how are Black women's experiences different? And when we went to look at the literature, there was no literature base, there were no empirical studies. There were studies that grouped women of color, but not necessarily a focus on Black women. And I would argue that even if there are a handful of differences between Black women, Latina women, Native women, and Asian American or indigenous population women, that still, those are really important differences, right? But we don't have the empirical work. There's not the work, there wasn't the work base at that time, or the literature that would help to even begin to answer that question at all. We were just being all looped together, lumped in together as so-called women of color. And so it became important to begin to really understand how unique experiences, lived experiences, how different intersectional lived experiences were playing out, and what were Black women specifically experiencing within computer science. But intersectional computing is really it's a budding field, but it's also a way of theorizing. It's a way of developing methods and methodology. It's a way of understanding the ways in which computing is structured and how power operates inside of computing to create different outcomes for different people who have different types of lived experiences that have historically been marginalized within the field.
Oh, thank you so much. And I appreciate you sharing the origin story, and how this was a response into feeling like ignored or pushed aside. And then you came, you shared your grievances, you talked about it, and then you made a whole new field. You guys are so productive. I love it. No, I mean, and I think it's great. And like appreciating like creating a body of literature, creating a body of work and study, so that we can better understand these experiences and not minimize differences, but really focus and showcase those, because they have unique and special influence on how our lived experience, our lived lives play out in the greater community. So, oh man, thank you. I'm so excited. I love to hear stories of how things happen. So Yolanda, as a professor and fellow scholar activist, how has your research created more inclusive and supportive spaces for Black women in computing in this field?
Well, in my work, I have really been tasked with trying to make sure that Black women's experiences are made salient to not just the computing community, but to the world. And I say that because, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, when we looked at the literature, there was really nothing about Black women's experiences in computing. And for me, when I thought about my experience, and that's why I shared certain aspects of my my motivations for being in the space and the challenges that I faced, I really was curious to know, are other Black women having those same experiences? Even though we're talking about 10, 15 years later, what really is the state of affairs for Black women in computing? We see and notice certain things when we go to computing conferences, especially those that are about diversity, but what are our experiences? And so for me, it was really important to center Black women. And when I say center, for me as a researcher, yes, I identify as a Black woman, but to also be willing to take a back seat to allow other Black women whose experiences may be like mine, that may diverge from mine, but there's room for that diversity of experience. And by amplifying their voices. You hear this phrase all the time, but for me, that meant capturing their stories, letting them be in control of the narrative as to what they think is important in their journey, how they're able to persist, the challenges they face, how they overcome, what are some of the typical social influences that encourage you or discourage you from being in this space, and then taking a seat back and taking that all in, because when you take that all in, you have to stop and pause and wonder, okay, what is going on in the field of computing? And I think this is critical, because if you think back to the movie Hidden Figures that came out, I think it was 2016, 17, somewhere up in there. Um, it talks about a generation of Black women that were game changers. They learned how to program that IBM mainframe computer, right? Yes, we talk about Katherine Jackson and how she was instrumental in the men arriving to the moon and getting back to the United States. This tells a very different picture, meaning that Black women were involved in computing years ago. So then what happened? Why is it that we're in such small numbers as uh, rather than being in much larger numbers? Why are we rendered invisible in this space? And so you begin to have to question what was going on then, because the climate in terms of what was happening back at that time of these women who were pioneers in the field of computing, and we're talking about Black women, and I'm sure that there were other women that were also visible, but something's going on between that time frame and here we are in 21st century, here we are in 2023. Again, I think about my experiences in this path when I first started back in the 90s, and again going back to grad school in 2008 and still dealing with the same issues. And so the field of computing has been structured in such a way that it benefits primarily white men. It's benefited, um, truthfully, Asian men. And I'm not saying this to say that it's a matter of these are bad people. I'm just saying that the people that come to mind, and when you think of computer scientists, aren't Black women. These are the faces. These are the, as they call them, the pioneers. These are the Bill Gates, the Elon Musk. I mean, these are not Black women. And so I think it's really important that we think about what that message conveys to the women, to the girls today, when they look at opportunities in the field of computing. Is this a field for them? Is there room for them? And the answer that am thinking about in doing this work of collecting Black women's narratives, of doing these interviews and analyzing these experiences, is that yes, but we have to be the ones that make the room for each other in these spaces. And it's not going to look like how it's looked in the past. And so what I'm saying to that is we're creating counter spaces for Black women to succeed, to thrive, to persist in computing. And that defies these constraints that have been defined by the field in terms of how you should enter the field, meaning, oh, you should have prior programming experience. We're defying those so-called, what's the ideal person for computing, and we're defining and doing it in our own way. I think that's really what my work is about, is creating those counter spaces.
Yeah, thank you. I love the emphasis on narratives. I love a counter space. Like anytime, it's really, I think, really wonderful, and it shapes the field. It shapes the profession, how young girls perceive it, how those who are in the field currently perceive it, and how it will change. So I appreciate that. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about like what you apply or how you apply different perspectives and frameworks in this intersectional computing space. So we are grateful for what you've shared so far. We are always excited in this community to add examples and strategies and tools and language to our repertoire as we work to think about how to make the world a more just place. One, it helps us to connect to and visualize the very important work that you're doing with Black women, Black girls in computing, but it also helps us learn from and with you about the experiences of the people and places that you are in service to, which is Black women in computing. And so I know that you guys apply Black feminist epistemologies as a critical frame or lens for viewing the intersectional experiences of Black women in computing. So I'd love to dig in a little bit. Dr. Thomas, how does applying Black feminist epistemologies enable you to more aptly characterize the experiences of Black women in computing?
I think that Black feminist epistemologies are incredibly powerful tools and lenses with which we not only elevate the voices of Black girls and women as intellectuals and experts about their own lived experiences, but it also gives us insights and clues about how we should be understanding various types of computing spaces in the context of Black women's own descriptions and words about their lived experiences. One example is recently myself, Dr. Rankin, and then Dr. Sheena Arate published a piece that focused on a concept called saturated sites of violence inside of computing. And this work is grounded in Patricia Hill Collins' work, who, of course, is the her work talks. She put forward the ideas and sort of premises around Black feminist thought, and wrote several books on intersectionality over the course of the past few years. And she talks about in her book, Intersectionality as a Critical Social Theory, this idea of saturated sites of oppression. She talks about the fact that for example, for Black women, because we are experiencing racism, sexism, in addition to many other types of oppressions, all at the same time, that the way in which those particular oppressions are intersecting and the experiences that we're having as a result of grappling and butting up against and bumping into these various structures and various parts of our lived experience means that power works in a particular type of a configuration. It's a configuration that she calls a matrix of domination. And she says that if you can look across the matrix of domination, you will find these sites of what she calls epistemic oppression, which really is about the ways in which your thoughts about your lived experiences are amplified, supported, or squashed and silenced. And so she provides breadcrumbs and sort of like clues as to how you can analyze various structures and various environments to identify those sites, and then how you can actually describe the ways in which power is moving within those sites to articulate the violence. And not only to articulate the violence, but also to articulate who is holding power in that situation, which types of oppression are intersecting to create that site, and then what the response is from the person or group or community that is experiencing that site. What are the ways in which they are resisting? Because that's really, really important, right? And I think that's something that often gets left out of a lot of things. It often becomes a tale of woe. But Black people have always resisted oppression, and Black women resist oppression inside of computing. There's lots of ways that they do it actively, as well as, honestly, our data suggests leaving the field is also a form of resistance, right? So she provides these clues around how you can analyze different types of environments to understand these sites of violence inside of computing. And what we've done is we've been able to take up the clues that she's left and apply them to our discipline. So for me, it helps to, again, going back to that original question of like, how are Black women's experiences different? It gives us tools and language and frameworks and theories to be able to really not only aptly describe the answer to that question, but to let the actual voices of Black women and girls lead in the telling of that story, because we are the experts of our own lived experiences.
If it's okay with you, Dr. Tay, I want to respond to what Jakita is saying.
Yeah.
Because what we're talking about here is actually revolutionary. In the field of computing, especially computing education research, there's been multiple studies that have focused on how to recruit and retain Black students in the field of computing. And it's not just been about Black students, there have been other marginalized groups. But the field itself has never had to contend with the issues of how it was structured to support certain groups, while at the same time marginalizing, oppressing, pushing away, limiting opportunities for other groups. In fact, they've placed the ownership as more a matter of deficiencies for a particular group. So, for example, oh well, the Black kids aren't really interested in computing, and these contribute to this false narrative in the field. Oh, we've got to do something to get more Black kids into computing, so we're going to expose them to computing in elementary, middle school, and that'll help increase the numbers. But what you see is that the interest of Black kids in middle school, high school, that's not the problem. It happens when they get to college in those early years, the freshman and sophomore years. And if they have a sincere interest in computing, it's discouraged, it's stifled, it's killed. And so you have to start asking the questions as to what is happening with their interest in computing. And then you start to realize it's got nothing to do with the Black students. It's the structures in which they define the field of computing. And so I'll give an example. If this idea is that you need to have prior experience programming coming into the field, and if you look across the education system in the United States, which by the way has rampant racism at play. This is the reason why when you look at a lot of schools that are in predominantly Black areas across the nation and you compare them to more affluent white neighborhoods, you'll see there's great disparities in terms of who has access to computing. But this goes again back to structures in education. Black kids have no control over that, no influence whatsoever in how decisions are made about where money is spent and how it's spent, where computer labs will be available, where they will hire teachers to teach those courses. This is about structures. This is about the structural domain of power. Well, that translates differently when you get to college, because you also have structures in these computing departments and even inherent in education at the level of what we consider to be, post-secondary education. And so departments will define for themselves these rules, these guidelines as to who is considered fit, who is considered prepared for computing. And they'll create these barriers so that if a student comes into an entry-level CS course and has not had prior programming experience, they're made to feel ill-prepared, less than, deficient again. And so they start to get this message that, well, I guess this is not for me. I'm not prepared. I can't come in here and be great and brilliant. I don't have the right background. And so they'll start to convince themselves that given the domain of structural power, that this is not for them. And so they'll end up going to another major, what have you. You can even have, as a result of interpersonal interactions with faculty, that tell you that perhaps you're not doing so well in the class and you should rethink your choice of major. That's a different domain of power. And so these things operate together to create this culture where there's a certain kind of student who dreams in binary code, zeros and ones at night. And that's the perfect student for us, and that's not you. And so Black women, we are talented, we're diverse, we have multiple interests. And so some of the stories that I've collected over the years, Black women talk about the fact that they're interested in dance, they're interested in arts and computing. But there's this idea, this culture, well, if you're going to do well and excel in STEM, then it's got to be all about, computing. This other stuff is a distraction. You're not really serious about the field. And so they're forced to make choices. Why is this the either or situation in the first place? So these are just some examples of how these systems of oppression play out and result in Black women being pushed out, or in some cases making the decision that I'm tired of pushing against these forces. It's not good for my mental health or my well-being. I'm going to do something different. In fact, there have been Black women who've created their own major to accommodate their interest in computing as well as the other things that they have interest in. This is what I mean by creating these counter spaces. So there's a lot of this going on in the field of computing that has not been addressed directly. And that's really what our work is trying to do. We're trying to hold the field of computing accountable for really identifying these structures and dismantling them, because we didn't create them, we can't dismantle them, but we can definitely create counter spaces in which Black women can thrive in the way that they see fit to do so. And I'll be quiet on that now.
No, thank you so much. I just it was like in the answering of this question, you have left us with so much knowledge about how to think about Black women's experiences in computing, thinking about both the language and frames that we use to describe and characterize in this example of saturated sites of violence in computing, thinking about the systems or the structures within our education system that start before we even get to college, and how they affect the stories that institutions and those who work with them are telling themselves about what they think the ideal student is, and how that influences the story like Black women begin to tell themselves because how they're treated or just not welcome or invited into that space. And so I mean, like, we're running out of time, but I'm so excited because I feel like this is the start of really the start of like a continued conversations in this space. As your field emerges in intersectional computing, I mean, I think it's a really exciting and wonderful counter space, as Dr. Rankin says, for both. I think both you guys who are in this field doing this work, but for like Black girls and Black women who are coming into it. I mean, to think that you can study computing and embody your Black feminist self, and doing so, like, when has that happened? I don't know. It didn't happen in my early life. And so I'm excited to see that it's happening here. And I appreciate the examples that you've shared with us. And so as we close, I would love for you guys to drop one more piece of inspiration on us. Thinking about what is like in this field, and as this field is emerging, what is one key learning from your research or practice that keeps you creating spaces or counter spaces for Black women to thrive in computing? If you could just share that with us, probably 60 seconds or less. I'll go Dr. Thomas, and then I'll go Dr. Rankin, and then we'll close out.
Oh my goodness, there's so much that has me incredibly excited about intersectional computing as a subfield, and also like the work that is coming out of this by so many scholars. A couple of weeks ago, a PhD, well, she is a newly minted doctor, Dr. Kalia Braswell, did her dissertation defense. And she specifically talked about the impact of intersectional computing on her work and how her work is situated, within that subfield. And at the end of her talk, which was so amazing, the work she's doing is so impactful. I thought to myself, how incredible is it that Black women have come to a place where we can get PhDs that focus on our lived experiences and the experiences of our community, and they be taken seriously as scholarship and not thought only as service, right? And only as outreach. So for me, I'm very excited about the scholars who are, co-creating this field with us and who are taking up some of the musings and the theories and the methodologies and the frames that we're trying to understand and refine within intersectional computing. I'm very excited about this next generation of scholars because they are on point, they are on fire, and they are like not about the foolishness.
I love it. Yes, Dr. Rankin.
Thank you for reminding me about the next generation of scholars. I want to add to this. We came into this space because of our experiences. The power behind intersectionality and intersectional computing, and even Black feminist epistemologies, which, by the way, is Black women's ways of knowing based upon our lived experiences. I want to be clear about that. But these frameworks actually position us to be allies with other historically excluded populations. I'm pushing against this false narrative of identity politics and divisiveness. That's what some of the so-called buzz has been. These recent news blurbs about intersectionality being divisive or feminism, Black feminism. Until you can engage in a conversation and make space for different perspectives that may not necessarily reflect your lived experience, but it's more about being able to respect and understand that each person is a human being. And in doing so, we can appreciate different perspectives and come to understand that not everyone is having the same experience. That's what the dialogue is about. And Black feminist thought talks about these dialogical interactions being crucial to developing critical consciousness. So if we're really about allyship, we have to be engaged in these conversations, however uncomfortable they may be, to get at the heart of the situation in order to build not only an appreciation for different perspectives, but to understand and build bridges for how we can work and support one another and each other. That is really what we're pushing for. So, yes, we're talking about Black women, but we're also talking about these frameworks, critical frameworks for other marginalized groups. And so this can become an example of how you do that. And so I really want to just impress upon people to join us in doing this work if you're really serious about making the field of computing equitable, diverse, inclusive for everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you, Dr. Rankin, for joining us, taking time out of your busy schedule and so generously sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your experiences with us. We know so much more and are better for it. And I just appreciate the conversations that around creating space and having dialogue and being able to share stories and narratives of your lived experiences and how that impacts the work that you do. That's an important part of the community here that we're trying to build. And, we're always be in support of the work that you're doing. And so thank you. I'll be cheering you on in your acts of resistance. I mean, to cheer you on. I'm so excited. And of course, I invite you to come back again and continue to have conversations about this work because I know new things will be popping off for you guys because that is who you are. So I appreciate it. So thank you so much. As we close, I just want to remind people that I will be back on Friday, March 24th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern for another Remix EQ Live episode. Well, I'll interview Jonathan McCrary, the artistic director for the National Black Theater. Yes, we're going to theater, darling. And we're going to talk about a representation in the arts. So watch your feed, check your inbox so that you have details to tune into the next show. And of course, share these deets with your peeps. And until then, visit the Remix EQ Live webpage for episode recordings and more information about our inspiring guests and upcoming events such as our weekend workshop for all my mission-driven leaders who do good work to support your organization to plan an evaluation that is inclusive and generates evidence of impact. Also, discover new ways to support the Remix EQ community via donation and purchasing of our Amplify notebook. And while you're on the show's webpage, please poke around the website and learn more about my business, Blue Knowledge, and our growing family of brands and services, which advances equity in schools and communities. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. And of course, I invite you to connect here in this space with me too. Thank you so much. Remix EQ community, for your engagement, your comments, your encouragement, and of course, your rally, which is how we recognize, appreciate, learn, love, and take care of you as you work to make the world a more just place. I'm your host, Dr. Erica Tate, and this is Remix EQ Live. And I'll see you next time.